First, I'd like to thank the Steamboat Institute Campus Liberty Tour for bringing this debate to Cornell University. This is the second year in a row that the Steamboat Institute has been instrumental in bringing two sides of a debate to Cornell University, which issues are typically considered to be beyond question. Cornell University, they have been the anchor for our alternative series of speakers on free speech. I would also like to thank you, the audience, for having the courage to publicly show your support for hearing more than one side of an important issue. This morning's Cornell Daily Sun, I saw Armand Chancellor's column entitled The Hollow University. This is a fresh talk. Armand wrote, "The current problems of institutions like the Ivy League and Cornell specifically are not, as many on campus today claim, rooted in their histories, but are in fact a modern or even postmodern problem. The problem is that our traditions throughout the campus mean nothing. The lost purpose allows us to keep the facade of the same institutions and traditions, but with hollowed out meaning. This is what allows Cornell to give out the same degrees despite the perpetually decreasing knowledge behind them. Every year, more and more students are crammed into lectures that professors and students alike couldn't care less about. Cornell and the university system has lost its purpose. That's what I want to talk about. Cornell and the university system has lost its purpose. Education and research, and instead has chosen to industrialize the degree process to the point that students outnumber beds. What is Cornell's purpose? What purpose was lost, and what purpose has replaced it? The traditional purpose of a university, first and foremost, has been the search for and dissemination of true knowledge. The search for true knowledge requires free and robust debate and a fight against the intellectual laziness and hubris that leads one to avoid looking at the totality of the evidence. However, as the purpose of Cornell has changed from the search for truth based on classical liberalism to social justice based on postmodernism and the assumption that there is no objective truth, words have lost the connection with reality. Words have become disruptive and violent. And disruption and violence has become the newest version of free speech. As Cornell alum Toni Morrison predicted in her 1993 Nobel lecture, oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is violence. Does more than represent the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. Sexist language, racist language, theistic language, all are typical of the policing languages of mastery and do not permit new knowledge or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas. I could not disagree more. Cornell has built a foundation on words that have become divorced from reality. And we must ask, what is the classical definition and value of free speech? And what is the postmodern definition and value of free speech? This debate will help answer those questions. T.S. Eliot wrote in The Hollow Man, which I guess was on your mind, about what occurred just after World War I and before the world ends in a whimper. In this last of meeting places, we grope together and avoid speech. I'm happy to say that there are students, faculty, staff, and alumni at the Heterodox Academy campus communities at Cornell University and SUNY Cortland who do not avoid speech and who are campaigning for the search for true knowledge through inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. There is also a phenomenal group of students at Cornell who represent the search for true knowledge through open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement through speech. This is the Cornell Political Union, and it represents the best that Cornell has to offer. On that note, I'd like now to introduce Daniel Obaseki, the president of the Cornell Political Union.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad you all can make it tonight. As Randy mentioned, I am Daniel Lasigi, the president of Cornell Political Union. We're a bipartisan debate society on campus that promotes viewpoint diversity and debate amongst all sides of the political spectrum. We invite a lot of speakers as well, like really prominent speakers such as George Casey, who was Army Chief of Staff to George Bush. We've invited Secretary Julian Castro, who was on Barack Obama's cabinet. And just last week, we invited Representative Tom Davis to speak to us about elections, who was the representative of Northern Virginia. And so it's been an amazing experience being with this organization, and I'm really thankful to have joined it. And I'm really looking forward to good news when I graduate. And so thank you so much for coming tonight to this debate with the Steamboat Institute. And following me, I would like to introduce the Vice President of Development for the Steamboat Institute, Miss, I am very sleep deprived right now, Haley Supergan. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much to Professor Wayne and to Daniel for the warm welcome. It is such a pleasure to be back on Cornell's campus for another compelling debate. I'd also like to thank, as Professor Wayne mentioned, the Heterodox Academy of Cornell and the Heterodox Academy of SUNY Cortland for helping sponsor and make this debate possible. The Steamboat Institute was founded in 2008 for the purpose of educating people about America's constitutional principles and fostering an appreciation of freedom that we enjoy as Americans. We launched the Campus Liberty Tour in 2018 with the goal of pushing back against cancel culture and inspiring free and robust debate. We hope you will leave this debate with new ideas and tools to have productive and substantive conversations with those around you. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, Steamboat Institute relies on the generous support of individuals and foundations to host programs such as tonight's debate. I would like to extend a special thank you to the Adolph Coors Foundation, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, and Pete and Marilyn Coors for supporting our Campus Liberty Tour. I also want to quickly mention that our 16th annual Freedom Conference will be in Beaver Creek, Colorado on August 23rd and 24th. Steamboat Institute provides scholarships to students and young professionals ages 20 to 29 that covers the cost of lodging, travel, and the VIP conference registration. Attendees meet with the speakers and network with some of our nation's key leaders. I hope that you will share this opportunity with students in your life, and for those attending here, I hope you consider applying for this scholarship or registering for the Freedom Conference at steamboatinstitute.org. Now, tonight's program, as Professor Wayne mentioned, is debating a resolution on an increasingly important topic. Be it resolved, universities are failing to provide a culture of free speech and open inquiry. Arguing the affirmative is Ilya Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro is a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. Previously, he was the executive director and senior lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. And before that, he was vice president of the Cato Institute and director of Cato's Center for Constitutional Studies. Mr. Shapiro is the author of Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations, and the Politics of America's Highest Court. His newest book, Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites, will be published this fall. He has contributed to a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, USA Today, National Review, and Newsweek. He has testified many times before Congress and state legislatures and has filed more than 500 amicus briefs in the Supreme Court. He lectures regularly on behalf of the Federalist Society, is a member of the Board of Fellows of the Jewish Policy Center, was an inaugural Washington Fellow at the National Review Institute, and has been an adjunct law professor at George Washington University and University of Mississippi. He holds an AB from Princeton University, a master's degree from London School of Economics, and a JD from University of Chicago Law School. Please welcome Ilya Shapiro. Arguing the negative is Dr. Marian Franks. Dr. Franks is the Eugene L. and Barbara A. Bernard Professor in Intellectual Property, Technology, and Civil Rights Law at George Washington Law School, where her areas of expertise include First Amendment law, cyber law, criminal law, and family law. Dr. Franks also serves as the president and legislative and Tech Policy Director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, the leading US-based nonprofit organization focused on image-based sexual abuse. Her model legislation on the non-consensual distribution of intimate images has served as the template for multiple state and federal laws, and she is a frequent advisor to the federal government, state and federal lawmakers, and tech companies on privacy, free expression, and safety issues. Dr. Franks is the author of the award-winning book, The Cult of the Constitution, and her second book, Fearless Speech, will be published this October. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School, as well as a doctorate and a master's degree from Oxford University, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Please welcome Dr. Marianne Franks. Moderating this debate is Amber Duke, Washington editor at The Spectator, co-host of Rising at the Hill TV, and senior Tony Blankley Fellow with the Steamboat Institute. Please welcome Amber Duke. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Oh. I don't think it's on.
As long as the online audience can hear you, I think everyone in here can.
Yeah. I can talk loud enough without the mic if needed, but it seems to be working now, so that's great. So welcome everyone for this wonderful debate. Obviously, both of these individuals are incredibly qualified to address this very key question about whether or not universities are doing enough to protect speech and open inquiry on
I have
campus.
to manage expectations. I'm up against a Rhodes Scholar here.
Again, both obviously very worthy individuals. And before we do get started, I want to remind everyone that there is a poll available for you to share where you fall on this debate now before we run through this excellent program. You can either agree, disagree, or say that you're undecided on the question of whether universities are doing enough to protect speech. We will do the poll now on your phones. I believe there should be a QR code available. And then at the end of the debate, you will go back and answer the question again, and we'll see if anyone's mind has been changed by our excellent debaters. For run of show, both of the debaters here are going to give us a 5-minute introduction. We will then move to a roughly 30-minute moderated session led by myself. Then we will take audience Q&A for about another 30 minutes, and we'll conclude with another 5-minute closing remarks from each individual. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with Mr. Shapiro. You will have 5 minutes to give your opening remarks.
Great. Thanks, Amber. And thank you to the Steamboat Institute. Wonderful organization. Great skiing in the winter, great policy conference in the summer. Thank you to Cornell, the political union, the other organizations here, the Heterodox Academy, that are facilitating this event. And this debate comes at a time of crisis for American higher education. For one thing, it's amazing that the heart of anti-Semitism in America is on campus, among the supposedly most educated and progressive people in the country. But, what? Keep the mic?
Okay.
Okay. All right. But I'd like my time, make sure I don't... Okay. But as Bill Ackman wrote the day that Claudine Gay resigned, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, a warning about larger issues, a leading indicator of assorted underlying pathologies. And here that means everything from cancel culture to ideological indoctrination, intellectual corruption to moral decay. We've seen a subversion of the core mission of universities to seek truth and develop human knowledge, and of classical liberal values like free speech and due process. It's been a shift from education to activism. There's a noxious postmodern ideology that contends that truth is subjective and must be viewed through lenses of race and gender and other identity categories, according to some privilege hierarchy. Your rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed. You'll hear some of this resonate, I think, in Professor Franks' framing of free speech versus fearless speech, or you could at least read about her framing in her well-written articles. Some of us have a lived experience with this sort of thing. Indeed, this warm reception that you've given me is very different than the one that I got when I tried to speak at the law school formerly known as UC Hastings 2 years ago. The response I got there was basically shut up. Well, cleaned up for polite company. The students there prevented the event from taking place, shouting and banging like it was an Occupy Wall Street event. It was the first time I'd ever been disrupted, and it's a damning indictment of the state of academia at a time when a toxic cloud has enveloped all of our public discourse. The protesters also castigated their own school for allowing me to speak and called for diverse student representatives to approve speakers, plus, of course, mandatory training in critical race theory. And never mind that Hastings, as a public institution, would be violating the First Amendment if it disapproved speakers based on their viewpoint. And never mind that, as one of the deans advised in the few minutes when the protesters weren't chanting and banging, not allowing an invited speaker to speak was against the rules. But the rules weren't enforced, and nobody was disciplined. Now, you'd think law students would have a greater appreciation for open engagement with the provocative ideas than undergrads. After all, they'll be here facing much harder situations than speakers they don't like. After all, my experience was no isolated incident. The following week, a similar thing happened at Yale Law School, ironically at an event bringing together speakers from left and right who agreed on nothing other than the importance of free speech. Then it happened at the University of Michigan at a debate on a Texas abortion bill. Then a year later, famously, the shout down of the federal judge at Stanford. The only thing these events had in common was that they featured non-progressive speakers. We've gotten to a place where questioning, say, affirmative action or abortion is outside the academic Overton window, the permissible range of expressed policy views. It's all well and good to adopt strong speech policies on paper or pixels, but it's not enough if presidents and deans aren't willing to stand up to those who demand censorship. And that includes other administrators. Proliferating DEI offices enforce an orthodoxy that stifles intellectual diversity and excludes dissenting voices. In fall 2022, when Justice Thomas withdrew from teaching at GW, Professor Franks' new school, it was just one more example of the poisonous atmosphere in academia that makes it impossible to have a free exchange of ideas. What you're experiencing now is the exception that proves the rule. GW officials rightly stood up to the mob, demanding that Justice Thomas be fired, but the fact that they needed to make that statement showed how they'd failed to instill a culture of open inquiry and truth-seeking. It's a shame that Justice Thomas felt the need to withdraw, and a stark contrast to the concurrent celebration of Justice Breyer returning to Harvard. I'm generally optimistic on America, but I'm pessimistic about academia. We may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover of legal education, of higher education in general. And I do mean illiberal. What we're seeing isn't the decades-old conservative complaint of hippies taking over the faculty lounge at Berkeley in the 60s, liberal professors. Instead, what we have are weak administrators who placate the radical left. It's the illiberal left that now drives campus culture, and university officials facilitate and even foment social justice mobs, with everyone else keeping their heads down so as not to be caught in the cancellation crossfire. University leaders are very good at instilling the values they care about: public service, social justice, entrepreneurship, whatever. They can and must do that for free speech, open inquiry, and civil discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Dr. Franks, 5 minutes to you as well.
Thanks very much. As was mentioned, I'm a law professor, and law professors are really annoying since that they answer a lot of questions with the words, "it depends." And so when I look at the resolved nature of this debate, to say that universities are either failing or not failing to provide a culture of free speech and open inquiry, my first thought is, well, it depends. And it depends a lot in the first instance. It depends a lot in the first instance. It depends a lot in terms of what we actually define those terms to mean. And I think it's hard to define what free speech and open inquiry actually mean. But I also think that it is possible to offer some ideas about what it might mean. And I want to suggest, because I've had the extraordinary privilege of being able to teach in institutions of higher education for almost 20 years now. That includes law schools, that includes community colleges, elite universities. What I would offer in terms of one of the many ways that you express yourself in terms of a university as committing itself to free speech and open inquiry is the possibility of examining received wisdom. So learning about it, of course, learning about traditions, learning about history, learning about all the great ideas that have come before, but also, really importantly, learning how to criticize those, to evaluate them, to see whether or not they are in fact grounded in evidence, whether or not they were mixed in with a history perhaps of exploitation or exclusion. To ask those kinds of questions, because the most important thing for us to understand when we are expressing our freedom of speech is that we have to have the power to criticize power. And it's that idea that not just now, but always, certainly when we see the recurrence right now of some of the rhetoric and the tactics from the 1960s, we are seeing that this kind of idea of the university, the ability to criticize power, is under attack. And it's under attack by really powerful forces. So what do we mean by this? What we have seen since 2021 is just bill after bill after bill being introduced by particularly Republican legislators saying, you can't have this book and you can't teach this concept. There are some concepts so scary, so threatening, that they have to be completely stripped out of university curricula. We are seeing members of Congress bringing together these McCarthy-esque hearings where they're hauling college presidents in front of them and demanding that they give them the answers that they want. And if they don't, threatening them with their jobs. What we're seeing over and over again is not just an objection to the kinds of ideas that are coming out of universities, but also the people who are behind those ideas. Think about how right up until this moment of controversy in the 1960s, where a lot of these same controversies were happening, until then, universities looked very, very uniform. There was one kind of person who was really allowed to be there. They were men. They were mostly white. The academy starts to change in the 1960s. It's not just the war. It's not just civil rights. It's all of these things. Suddenly, other people have knowledge too and are able to criticize knowledge too. And what happens? People get really upset. The government gets upset and they send in troops. So what are we seeing right now? Some universities are capitulating to this kind of attempt to intimidate and to try to repress and to try to censor speech. We've seen this most recently with the Columbia president, who thinks apparently that selling out her faculty and arresting her students is going to save her from getting fired. We have seen this when we have USC canceling the graduation speech of its own valedictorian because people didn't like her and didn't like the things that she might say. We have seen these kinds of donors and judges and really powerful individuals tell universities, we're going to take away our support if you don't do as we say, if you don't crack down on speech we don't like. So how can I say in any sense that actually, yes, some universities, some of the time, are honoring free speech and open inquiry? Well, they're having to do it against this background. They're having to do it against these threats. They're having to do it against these threats on sometimes their lives, certainly their professions, certainly all kinds of consequences that are being mobilized against them right now that we are seeing in real time. But what is still happening? Columbia, NYU, other places, students are rising up anyway and saying they are going to criticize power. They are going to try to bring some kind of visibility to injustice. And sometimes their faculty is standing up for them. Sometimes the faculty is standing up in front before those students and saying, we stand with you. We'll get arrested before you. The incredibly brave letter by the faculty members out at Columbia, especially the ones who don't have tenure, the ones who didn't have job security, saying, we stand with you. We honor you. We know that the university is actually about you and your ideas. So to that extent, to that kind of message, to that kind of commitment in the face of intimidation, I say, yes, some students, some faculty are still committed to free speech and open inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you both for your opening statements. And Dr. Franks, I think we're going to start by jumping right into this current flashpoint on campus that you mentioned in your opening remarks, what is happening at places like Columbia University, NYU, and others. Campuses are struggling with how to deal with the outpouring of pro-Palestinian protesters who are advocating for universities to divest their endowments from index funds that have corporations that do business in Israel. And on some campuses, most notably Columbia, the students have decided that one form of protest they'll engage in is setting up physical encampments in university quads. Hundreds of students have faced disciplinary action, including arrest, suspension, and expulsion. They say that the university infringed on their rights to speech, while the university says that they simply violated campus policy. Who is correct in this debate? We'll start with you, Dr. Franks. We'll give you 2 minutes, and then we'll allow Mr. Shapiro to respond.
They can both be correct. It can be true that there are violations of campus rules, and it can be true that a president is entitled to say, we're going to punish you for breaking those rules. But the question that we're facing today, the topic of this debate, is whether or not that fosters a culture of open inquiry and freedom of speech. And I think the answer to cracking down on peaceful protesters, that's maybe they are, in fact, violating some of the campus rules. The idea that cracking down on peaceful protesters, evicting them from their dormitories and arresting them, subjecting them in some cases to physical endangerment and calling for them to be physically endangered. This is not something that I think can be considered compatible with freedom of expression.
I wrote up an essay for the Free Press, that's Barry Weiss's publication, back in November, about the limits of free speech. Now, I take second place behind no man or woman in advocating for the freedom of speech. That's why I'm here today. But we have to understand that certain actions are not speech. If you beat somebody up or you vandalize property, you don't get protection for having a political or expressive motive for doing that. Certain types of speech are not protected themselves. Death threats, incitement of violence. And then we have what lawyers call time, place, and manner regulations. So you can't block roads, you can't deny access to buildings, you can't harass and stalk and do these other things. And even for political speech, I can't go to your neighborhood in the middle of the night and with a megaphone tell you exactly what I think of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So what is happening at Columbia with the supporters of terrorism, the defenders of the gang raping barbarians of Hamas and their ilk, is that they are not protesting, they're not expressing their speech. What they are doing is violating rules. They are harassing people, they're stalking, they're engaged in criminal behavior. And Columbia is failing in clearing out the encampment, arresting, expelling, deporting those who are foreigners, as is their power, as is their duty to ensure under federal law that the other students have an equal opportunity to receive the education. That's under federal law and also under the contract that everyone signs when they matriculate. So it's unfortunate that professors are not being fired, that students are not being evicted and expelled and suspended. Where they are, where university leaders actually enforce the rules that are actually in place, these things don't happen. Encampments were cleared out in Yale, University of Minnesota, lots of other places, and we don't have this farce where hopefully the president eventually will be forced to resign for the failure of leadership that she is displaying and fomenting this spread of anti-intellectual, illiberal, university-destroying activity that we're seeing.
So, Dr. Franks, how would you respond to the assertion that these students are not engaging in protected speech?
I think, first of all, we have to be careful about which students we're talking about and whether we're talking about students at all. So first and foremost, the events that are developing at Columbia are happening in real time. There is a lot of concern, or there should be a lot of concern, about how accurate some of the reporting is. And even when it's accurate, whether or not it's properly placed in context. What we do know is that the New York Police Department itself said that all of the students that it arrested were peaceful. That's what we know. The New York Police Department, which is not particularly well known for sympathizing with students who are protesting, says they're peaceful. So what does that mean? Does it mean that there haven't been instances where people have been violent, where they have engaged in harassment? No, both of these things can be true at the same time. And the proper response to people who are engaging in intimidation and harassment and violence is yes, to certainly stop them from doing that. But the vast majority, as far as we know, according to the people who are actually on the ground there, according to the student reporters who are bravely continuing to report out of there, the vast majority of these protests are peaceful. And they include, incidentally, not just people who are whatever it means to say pro-Palestine, but many Jewish students who are standing in solidarity and saying we want to point out the atrocities that are being committed. We want to criticize the US government. What is more protected by the First Amendment than criticizing the government when you think it is acting in the wrong way?
Is there a point, and I'll take this to you first, Mr. Shapiro, is there a point at which a campus protest could potentially infringe or stifle the speech of other students? One of the contentions with what's happening at Columbia is that Jewish students in particular say that they've been harassed, that they've been physically prohibited from entering the protest space by students who have created walls, essentially. So at what point, again, does this type of protest that's done in a physical manner actually stifle the speech of others? And does that render it not protected?
Well, that's not even speech. That's actions that are against the rules that do intimidate and harass and prevent students from accessing the education that they're paying for, much less being a heckler's veto. I mean, that's a separate issue. If there was a protest disruption here that prevented us from having our discussion, that would be a heckler's veto if those disruptors weren't removed. But in a public square, it's a different sort of situation than disrupting a class or a reserved event. Here, there's actual harassment, intimidation, violating rules about access, and all of these other things, which is a real problem. We debate the definition of peaceful and whether the protests are mostly peaceful or what have you. But Columbia has gone officially now virtual for the rest of the school year. That is disrupting. That is infringing on the rights and the contracted for service that the whole rest of the student body is getting from Columbia. Hopefully, there's now going to be a class action or what have you. This is mismanagement, bad leadership. I mean, this goes far worse than just creating a climate of cancel culture or fear or where people are walking on eggshells. This is the example of the failure of university leadership to provide a welcoming and effective educational environment.
And to you, Dr. Franks, a response to Mr. Shapiro, and namely, what balance do universities have to provide to competing student groups that are protesting?
I think that's really why a lot of universities feel that they're caught in a kind of impossible situation. On the one hand, you have this commitment, or at least this commitment we're supposed to have to open inquiry. The idea borrowed from the First Amendment, which of course is not directly tracked what most universities are going to be obeying, but are certainly inspired by. It's the idea of robust, uninhibited debate is sometimes really ugly. And what that means is that out of context or without more details, we don't know if action one is something that should be considered protected speech or whether or not it's necessarily something that should be considered harassment. It is actually a really difficult calculus sometimes to figure this out. And the idea of hostile environments and discrimination and the rest of it, those are extremely important questions. They're not the kinds of questions that are best decided by social media or by the mainstream media coming in, not knowing what the situation is, taking a few pictures, talking to one person, not verifying, not trying to figure out whether or not this is in fact the reality that is unfolding. This is not the way to do things. And so, yes, universities are in a tough spot, but they are supposed to care about what their students are trying to express. They are supposed to be the guides for students if they are overreacting, if they are acting in a way that is hostile to others. It is the duty of faculty members and administrators to actually show if there is some kind of wrong here, show them how to make it right.
Universities might be in a hard spot, but the solutions are very easy. And we've seen it happen because it's not that university presidents and deans and provosts are all acting uniformly or wringing their hands uniformly. When there was a student takeover of the Vanderbilt University president's office, those students were eventually removed. Those who had assaulted campus security were arrested and expelled. That's how you deal with it. Yale, which has gotten a lot of black eyes in the last few years over dealing with speech, especially at the law school, but in general as well, cleared out its encampment and is pursuing discipline against those who, again, use physical impediment to prevent the educational mission and so forth. At the University of Chicago, these things don't happen because a long time ago, president upon president upon president simply says, we will not police speech, but here are the rules and we will enforce them. And when there's a mob demanding this or that, yeah, you have free speech rights, but you don't have the right to shut things down or occupy places that impede other students and all the rest of that. This is not some theoretically difficult conundrum of public policy or otherwise, where, you know, there's a reason why the Biden administration, not the Trump administration or some other, you know, scary Republican, is investigating so many of the so-called elite schools for their Title VI violations. And none of the schools in the SEC, say, the Southeastern Conference, there is a playbook of what you do in these circumstances. There's a clear delineation between speech and non-speech, protected speech and non-protected speech, and time, place, and manner regulations.
Dr. Franks, would you like to respond?
Sure. I also agree that there's something very telling about the fact that it is also the Biden administration that is condemning protests as being anti-Semitic without much evidence. When I say that the problem, the most scary kind of speech for anyone in power is the kind of speech that challenges power, I mean that. I mean that we're talking about a situation where students are daring to say, our government is wrong. So are we surprised that the government is responding by saying, you are all anti-Semites and you should be arrested? Well, you know, I'm not surprised by this. It shouldn't reassure us, though. And I'm very wary of people who are suddenly very clear on the fact that they themselves, without being part of the situation, not part of the community, not a faculty member, not a student there, saying, I know, that person knows exactly what the line is between what is protected and what is not, what is speech and what is not, what is harassment, what is not. I would also like to point out that to the great lauded University of Chicago, which I love because I spent a couple of years there myself, only a few years ago, they had an incident where there was a untenured faculty member who wanted to teach a course called The Problem of Whiteness. And a student got really upset about it, so upset that he managed to coordinate a harassment campaign against her so that she received death threats and intimidation, and she couldn't actually carry out the course. So if we're going to say that because Chicago has some nice principles on paper, that they're actually trying to protect all of their faculty and all of their students, I think we should be a little bit skeptical about who is being protected and when and under what circumstances.
I'd like to go to Mr. Shapiro on that. Do you think that the University of Chicago should have allowed that professor to teach the Problem of Whiteness course and provide her perhaps whatever security necessary in order for her to do so?
Well, death threats are not protected speech, and they should be investigated and prosecuted. There was here at Cornell, there was a student back in October who was issuing death threats and rape threats and was appropriately arrested and I imagine expelled. And you know, that should certainly be done. In terms of which courses are approved, there's a process for approving courses, and I'm not familiar with the details of, you know, whether it had been approved and then she was intimidated into not teaching it or what the case might be. But as long as the proper processes were followed for, you know, I don't think it matters whether she was tenured or not. But you know, there could be an issue, and this is more of an issue with public institutions than private, because taxpayers should be, you know, funding all sorts of things necessarily, but private schools have wide latitude. And again, I don't know the specifics, but if you know, the course was approved and then for some reason she was prevented from teaching it, that's a problem. That's a breakdown in the system.
I'd like to move to an incident that happened actually right here at Cornell University. Well, really a couple of incidents related to An Coulter, the conservative commentator, who is a noted immigration restrictionist. She spoke here a couple of years ago and was shouted down by students, some of whom were disciplined. And the university actually invited her back, saying that what had happened was not consistent with its values relating to free speech. This time around, it was a professor who interrupted An Coulter, and that professor was removed and arrested. Mr. Shapiro, we'll start with you. Did Cornell handle this situation properly?
I think so. Again, I haven't drilled down on the specifics or you know, obviously talked with law enforcement, or, you know, the file is private in terms of what Cornell's own disciplinary process. But there are rules against you know, being disorderly and observing the proper way to ask questions in Q&A and whatever else. And since she's being prosecuted, clearly there is a probable cause to believe that this professor was not observing, you know, not even the rules of the university, but the criminal law. And so, you know, Cornell, which is celebrating its year of free expression, I wouldn't necessarily have invited An Coulter in the first place. I mean, she's kind of a, you know, amazing. Part of this is you have a right to do something. It's not necessarily prudential to invite the most provocative people necessary. You know, but a lot of incidents over the years at Cornell, for some reason, have involved this very famous alumna of theirs. But as far as I know about this specific incident, recently this year, what I understand, the process seems to have worked.
And Dr. Franks, do you think Cornell handled the An Coulter situation properly? And are there any speakers that a university should not platform?
So did they handle it correctly? I think the broader question is one that Mr. Shapiro's made reference to, which is what was the reasoning behind inviting her to begin with? What was the benefit? And I say that because very often what we focus on is what was the reaction and how do you deal with the reaction? And if we actually care about how to avoid situations like this, I think sometimes more analysis needs to be done at the front end to say, well, does this person, besides being provocative and controversial, have anything to offer? There are a lot of speakers in the world. There are a lot of topics to discuss. And certainly, I would want to say that if the concern at universities is anti-Semitism, I'm really not sure what you're doing inviting An Coulter, who's notoriously made anti-Semitic comments in the past, including suggesting that Jews need to perfect themselves to become Christians and complaining about the fact that there was pandering to Jews in the elections. So I really do wonder about the wisdom of bringing someone like that here. So as to whether or not somebody should shout them down, it doesn't seem very good for someone to do so because you don't really get your point across. And I do think that this is part of a playbook, right? There's a certain tendency to substitute the idea of good ideas with provocative ideas. And there's a playbook that says, let's invite a controversial speaker, bait some people, say some really offensive things. They get baited, they fall for it. They then start shouting that person down. And then you get this loop of saying, you see, these students are intolerant or this faculty member is intolerant. So I think it was a bad spectacle, a non-edifying spectacle for that reason. As to whether or not there are some speakers you should just not platform, one would hope so, right? One would hope that you would not want to invite notorious anti-Semites to your campuses, that maybe you shouldn't be inviting Mike Cernovich ever to your campus, not only because he doesn't have anything to offer, but also because if you were concerned about hostile environments, maybe you should be concerned about someone who is committed to white supremacy. So yes, we should be asking some of those questions, both about the quality of their ideas and whether or not their very presence and their ideas targets certain vulnerable communities and makes them less safe, less secure. What are those speakers doing on those campuses?
Who would be the right person on a university campus to determine whether or not a speaker has something to offer?
I think that's one of those things that really does need to be part of the way that you have a system designed to talk about students' concerns, about faculty's concerns, because of course there are scarce resources. We can't just say, well, invite whoever you want, and whoever gets invited, we just cannot make any distinctions about how that's going to go. I think that one thing that universities could really improve upon is encouraging faculty and students to have more say earlier on about who it is who's going to get invited, how much of their possibly scarce resources in terms of speaker fees and security fees should be going to one particular individual as opposed to someone else. My view would be to just make it more democratic.
I would say to use Professor Frank's formulation, it depends. Because there are invitations made by the university as a whole, by the president or the executive office. There are invitations made by an academic department, by a student organization, right? Lots of people invite speakers, and there are processes in place. If you're a duly registered student organization, means you've submitted a constitution and you have, member of whatever the rules are at a given campus, you should be able to invite whoever you want, essentially. Now, again, having the right to do something doesn't mean it's a good idea to do so. And sophomores are called sophomoric for a reason. Undergrads, especially, invite people to be provocatorish and create, this dynamic that Professor Franks discussed, gain notoriety. But once you invite someone, I think it's very bad to create, to disinvite or to talk about who's platforming and what's platforming and all this. But there is a substantive difference between a university officially in its own capacity inviting someone and a student organization doing so. And we should evaluate the wisdom of these things. And frankly, the legalities of them are slightly different depending on who's involved.
A follow-up to Dr. Franks, would making the process more democratic potentially lead to a tyranny of the majority? You spoke earlier about the importance of students being able to speak truth to power, particularly to the government. If their views, though, happen to fall into the minority and the majority on campus say that they shouldn't be allowed to bring a certain speaker or they shouldn't be allowed to express a certain opinion, does that have the potential to backfire in terms of suppressing speech that might be considered a minority opinion, but ultimately is maybe rooted in objective truth?
I don't think there are any easy answers to that, right? I think that when we're asking about, well, will this particular change in the system mean that that's going to create suddenly a tyranny of this or that? I think what is really worth noting here is that every system we have right now is prone to some abuse, and that we're getting choices by not choosing in some ways. So if you simply say, for instance, that student organizations, whoever gets there first, right, is able to bring in who they want. And then the question is whether or not there's going to be a counter protest or something else. And I think that's not a great system, or at least you're not avoiding making certain choices about who's going to feel that this was a speaker that actually represents something that the majority or the number of people who have made a good argument for why this person should be a speaker. There are no easy answers to this. I think the real point is for a university to be confronting the fact that there aren't easy answers. That when you make a choice about a speaker, when you make a choice to pay the money and give the time and the disruption and whatever else it might be, we need to be open and accountable about that. Administrators need to be open and accountable. Student organizations need to be open and accountable. And it needs to be a broader discussion to figure out, well, what is it as a university we're actually trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, universities are supposed to have wide-ranging discussions of controversial and provocative issues, and counter-protesting is fine. Leafleting, writing letters to the editor of the school paper, all that is great. What's not great is disrupting events, physical violence or otherwise. I mean, these rules are all delineated. There's a difference between protest and disruption, and almost every school has that on the books. We don't need to rewrite our policies to make these things clear. And the problem precisely is that dominant cultures, dominant viewpoints are imposed both from above in terms of the culture that the university leaders marshal, and in terms of peer pressure, and in terms of investigations. And oftentimes the process is the punishment of the HR office for faculty, the DEI office or student affairs, these biased response teams where anytime some student feels uncomfortable or quote unquote unsafe, and by unsafe meaning encountering an idea they don't like, they report it, and away we go to this Kafkaesque inquisition that's going to be made all the more easier with the new Title IX regulations that just dropped, where you can't even confront your accuser or see the evidence against you. So who's in power, right? All of the idea generating institutions in this country are controlled by the left, whether it's academia, whether it's culture, Hollywood, technology, or what have you. So if you want to democratize things, on campus, that could be the tyranny of the majority in a certain sense. But speaking truth to power means opposing the, sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the far left hand is doing, or is placating it somehow. That's why we're in the situation we're in, because university officials have not allowed discourse to flourish. And it's completely the opposite of what we had in the 60s, when it was the left that was demanding freedom of speech.
Dr. Franks?
This idea that the left is in control of things is an interesting one. If we look at, for instance, the fact that if we are looking at political affiliation, maybe that's what we're talking about here, and we look at how the political affiliation, let's say, of the vast majority of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies skew heavily Republican.
That's not true.
What does it tell us? What does it tell us that, for instance, military officials also skew heavily Republican? What does it tell us about anything, right? What I think is the problem here, and the reason why the university in particular draws this kind of attention, is because it is one of the few places where the right can't be completely dominant. Cannot be completely dominant, even though through massive donor funds can be pretty dominant. And again, by having power of members of Congress to haul people in front of the panels and make them essentially try to give them some sort of loyalty test. But the thing that has always been frustrating to the right about universities is that they can't really control them, because this is what happens when you bring young people in, You bring them into an environment where they're learning things and they're told, oh, that's not how I thought history was. Oh, I never learned that before. And they're meeting people that they were told were no good or not interesting or whatever it is about them. They are meeting new people. They are learning new things. And then suddenly they start criticizing things. And that, I think, is what a rear guard kind of conservative, regressive mindset that wants to preserve power and the status quo gets very nervous about. And we see it over and over again.
I'd be in full agreement with Professor Franks if this was, 1952, but it's 2024, and the shoe is on the other foot. Just completely.
I'll end with one last question before we go to audience Q&A, and that is regarding some surveys about campus speech from places like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. They have made the determination based on various indexes that they use that universities are not protecting speech, that their speech zones are too rigorous, that students shout down speakers too frequently. And then from a student perspective, conservative students are far more likely than liberal students to say that they self-censor either for fear of being canceled by their peers or facing retribution or retaliation from professors or administrators. Dr. Franks, I'll start with you and then I'll allow Mr. Shapiro the rebuttal. Do you think that their fears are unfounded?
The conservative fears about
that
being
they feel they have to
ostracized or-
self-censor?
So I always think that that's an interesting term, the self-censorship. And as a law professor and as a lawyer, my answer is always, well, what's the evidence, right? There's a reason why we don't just let people make claims based on how they feel, right? Lots of people feel like they're going to be ostracized if they say something in class. Now, that may be because what they have to say is so provocative, or maybe because it's not very smart. It could be for any number of reasons that you might be hesitant about what you're about to say. So there's proof that you are being treated badly by, and unfairly, I should say, treated badly, unfairly by a professor, that there is some sense in which you are being graded differently. Yes, that would be a legitimate complaint, but you need evidence, not a feeling. And when it comes to the idea of self-censorship leads to ostracization, what that sounds like people are saying is, I want to be able to say the things I want and have everybody like me and praise me for it. And I'm scared that if I say the things that I really feel, people won't like me. Well, I'm sorry that is just really how the world works. People can have the choice not to like you for what you say and what you think. And if that is something that upsets you, well, you are entitled to change your mind, to change your views. But no one is required to like you or to associate with you if they don't want to. So I don't know what the solution here is being proposed to say that there are certain people who feel like they can't speak because other people won't like them. Well, maybe take a hard look at what it is that makes your speech so unlikable. But regardless, what do you think the answer is other than to try to force people to sit with you at lunchtime?
Universities are not fonts of hidden Nazis, other than these pro-Hamas people that have come out in the last 6 months. People feel that they can't express mainstream views. These surveys repeatedly show that only, not just liberals, but only the far left, ultra progressives feel comfortable expressing themselves, not from because of peer ridicule, but because of the structures and systems that are in place that the university imposes and enforces, that prevents having a healthy culture of open inquiry and free discourse. There's evidence upon evidence of, it's simply facetious to say that there's no evidence that this is happening. It's to be in a big bubble, as we saw from the university presidents at the hearing in December, where they can't even express that calling for killing people, whichever people, however you want to kill them, is against our values, regardless of going into the legal niceties of the context of free speech. And yes, even offensive and hate speech is protected, but it depends on the context, and this is harassment and all the rest of it. There's such a failure of leadership because of these institutional left-wing bubbles, radical left bubbles, that again, the presidents, the deans, the university leaders aren't necessarily the social justice warriors, but they are responsible for creating this atmosphere where students come in and they don't learn these things because it's considered unsafe or a harassment to encounter ideas that they think are provocative.
So that's going to lead us into our first audience question, which is about what happened on October 7th, the terror attack by Hamas. And the question is, does do the atrocities committed diminish the right to free speech of those who support those atrocities? And one of the points brought up earlier was about the USC valedictorian whose right to give a commencement speech was canceled because she had expressed views that some determined to be anti-Semitic. Was USC right to cancel that speech over fears that her political views could distract from the commencement? Or was this a violation of her speech rights, Mr. Shapiro?
Even anti-Semites, even the most hateful racists have the right to free speech. All Americans do. That's what makes this country great. But there's a time and a place, and there are certain things that are not speech. Again, I'm repeating certain things that I said before. And even though it's rich that the same people who on October 6th would have subjected people, students and faculty, to a star chamber for using the wrong pronouns, all of a sudden say that it's okay to call for genocide. That's fine. Americans have the right to be hypocrites as well in this regard. That's not a crime. The issue with the commencement address is that is not a forum for any kind of political speech. She could have been dedicating her speech to the how the IDF is the most civilian protecting armed force in the history of mankind, which is true, but that would not have been an appropriate thing to say at a commencement address. Clearly, there's a policy at USC, which is a private school, to I guess you have to submit what you're going to say, and that's screened. And I'm sure there's objective criteria that says you can't just give a political message. You can't endorse Joe Biden or Donald Trump. You can't give a screed on this or that. It's simply inappropriate. Or for that matter, give your analysis of why this is USC. The LA Dodgers are going to win the World Series this year or something. Just not an appropriate thing. And so I assume it's based on those kind of objective criteria that this was disproved.
Dr. Franks?
That was a lot of words to say that censorship is okay if we really, really don't like the speech. And so from what I can tell, what you have here is you've got a valedictorian who deserves this honor, who earned this honor. We're not talking about even an invited speaker, right? There's so much empathy, sympathy, deference to the idea of the invited speaker. She's a student. She's supposed to be graduating. She's supposed to be able to give her speech. And merely because some people don't like what they think she might say or something that she has said in the past, she is going to be denied that. I think that there's no way to say that USC here has acted in a way that comports with free speech. And I also want to say that we have to be really, I think, very skeptical about the characterization of people's speech this way. People who want to justify censorship are always keen to characterize the speech as, well, that's over the line, or that's definitely conduct. But again, we're talking about situations where people are not calling for genocide. They are criticizing genocide. They are criticizing the actions of governments. They are taking a stand on important geopolitical matters. That is political speech. That is part of what it means to be a student. That is part of what it means to be a university that can face up to really difficult and contrarian opinions about what is going on in the world.
I believe strongly in academic freedom and that it's inappropriate for governments to regulate what professors say inside the classroom. Nonetheless, I think if a math professor came up and decided to discuss his views on, I don't know, the Boer War, I think it would be appropriate for him to be, disciplined for that, because that's not within his job description. Doesn't mean I guess you could call it censorship, but it's proper regulation of speech in the context of the limited forum of a math classroom. Similarly, a commencement address is not the place to discuss something other than, what we can define in objective terms as a commencement address, which is not a political speech. It's not a sports analysis. It's not, a math lecture for that matter. You don't want to be too cute with these discussions of what's censorship and what's not.
Dr. Franks, since Mr. Shapiro responded, I'll allow you a response as well.
Thanks. I think that this is interesting because this is the first time we've ever seen a valedictorian, to my knowledge, be canceled on the basis of what people assumed that her speech was going to be about. And the reason that she was given was, we can't guarantee your safety. And then when she pressed them on this to say, what do you mean? What are the threats that are being made? It wasn't about saying this is an inappropriate speech. That was not the reason that she was given. They said, you're not safe. We can't keep you safe. And she pushed back and she said, give me the evidence of what the threat is. And essentially what she was told, to my understanding, is that, well, actually, we could keep you safe, but that's not what we want to do at graduation. So I think, yes, if we're going to create hypotheticals about how, well, let's create a situation in which someone is doing something completely antithetical to what the context calls for, but that is not that particular situation.
A follow-up for you on this point and what happened with Ann Coulter. You suggested that people were mischaracterizing the USC valedictorians' views as anti-Semitic when they were merely protected political speech. But you also said that Ann Coulter might not provide a benefit to a university because she has expressed things that are anti-Semitic. So what makes your characterization of anti-Semitic more valuable than perhaps the people who are criticizing the USC valedictorian?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're more valuable, but I think the difference is that she is the valedictorian. She is a student. She is a member of that community. And she was given a just honor because she deserved that honor. And Coulter, I think the question that we need to be asking about speakers like this is, what was the value add of this person? What is their experience? What is their idea? What is it they're contributing to the community? Because she's not part of the community. So there needs to be some justification for why you and not someone else. The context is extremely different when we're talking about a student who is actually the person who's supposed to have this moment and to have this honor.
She was an alumna who was invited by a student group, though.
I believe she was invited by the provost.
Okay.
Well, this year she was invited by a provost, but anyway, she's as an alumni, I guess she's part of the community in that sense. We don't want to debate the minutia of the. We're not sure about the facts of USC, whether they requested that she submit a thing and then they didn't cancel her after reviewing what she was going to say, or they were just anticipating that she was going to say. But the safety concern really is rich. This most often happens, of course, to speakers invited by more conservative groups where the university doesn't like their speech and so tries to cancel them by invoking this safety bugaboo.
This is a great question, I think, from the audience. It sounds like Dr. Franks feels the greatest risk to free expression is from the right, while Mr. Shapiro feels the greatest risk to free expression is from the left. It is always the hardest to see the problematic aspects of your own side. We'll start with Dr. Franks. What do you see as potentially the greatest problem from the left when it comes to free expression on campus?
I'll be clear to say that I think the state of free expression everywhere is pretty bad. That is to say, the reason why I think, and the reason why I've written books and articles about this problem, about what it means to have a free speech culture in the United States, is because we're not doing it well. There's this tendency in the United States across political parties to say, oh, the First Amendment is this wonderful thing. We understand exactly what it means and exactly what it entails. And we have this tendency as Americans to just sort of congratulate ourselves and say, we're the best in terms of freedom of speech across all possible ways of doing this. And I think that is really an obstacle to becoming a society that's actually open to free speech. What I think really happens is you find a point for everyone where they say, I don't mean speech like that. I am supporting speech. I'm supporting speech, until there comes a moment where all of a sudden, all the reasons come out where not that kind. I didn't mean that kind. So I think that is a problem that I think is shared across the political spectrum in the United States. And I think that the best way out of this is to be confrontational about it, to say, look, whatever else you may want to think, whatever we were taught to believe, there was never any such thing as absolute free speech in America. It never happened. And there probably shouldn't be, because absolute free speech looks something like Twitter, right? So we don't want like this. We don't want mere chaos to reign. We want to have standards. We want to have good ideas. We want to have human conversations. We want to get better and learn things and not waste our time. So we also have to draw some boundaries about what is too harmful, what is actually protected but outrageous, should be promoted, right? All of those are hard questions, but none of us can get to that question if we keep telling ourselves, oh no, we're absolutists, we let everything except for this. Everybody has a limit. Everybody has a boundary. Let's confront the fact that we have those boundaries and actually start talking about how we can be principled in applying those boundaries and be principled in applying those exceptions.
I hope nobody has understood anything I've said to suggest that there should be limits or punishments of pure speech. That's not the point here. The problem is you have you have conduct rather than speech. You have unprotected speech like death threats and incitement of violence, things that I believe strongly in the First Amendment standard as the Supreme Court has laid it out. And then you have regulations and time, place, and manner things, like you can't block roadways in the campus context. You also can't block, pathways and disrupt classes and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not about the content of the speech. It's what exactly you're doing. I'm with FIRE. Amber mentioned FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, probably my favorite nonprofit group in the country that I've never gotten a paycheck from. They defend people on the left and the right, from cancellation attempts on the left and the right, from, you name it. And most of their staff is not rabid right wingers. Most of them vote Democrat. Most of them are like old school ACLU types. And I'm fine with that. 60s liberals are great. The problem is that those baby boomer liberals are retiring and they're afraid of their students, who are this radicalized wing of illiberals, and university administrators are placated.
Mr. Shapiro, what do you think the greatest threat to free expression from the right is?
It's not on university campuses. It's isolated yahoos like Charlottesville and things like that. These militias and things that we hear about, that the rabid illiberal populists of the right that do exist but have no power whatsoever. So in the current context, the threat to speech, to democracy, to classical liberal values are much greater in this country from the left than from the right.
Dr. France, you may have a moment to respond if you like.
Just point out that it's kind of an odd moment to say, the left and the right, when the left and the right are kind of aligned on this, right? It's not as though in the 60s and the 70s, the people who were advocating for freedom of speech were on the right. It was the people on the left. And so the convergence there, I think, should alarm everyone. There's a convergence here that is essentially about hanging on to power, because power is more important even than political affiliation. And I wish it were true that there were isolated yahoos in UVA and other places and the insurrectionists, right? I wish it were containable. I wish we didn't actually have to look at the fact that the greatest threat of violence in this country is actually from white supremacists and domestic terrorism. But it's true. And we need to worry about that. And we need to worry a lot more than we have in the past. And a lot of the ways that white supremacists have been able to get the kinds of incursions that they have has been by dressing up their activities, their conduct, their terror as speech. And it's about time that we confronted that.
Over the past 10 years, we've seen a trend pop up on campuses of things like safe spaces, trigger warnings, and basically labels and places that students use or go to when confronting speech that they deem to be a threat to themselves or their mental health. Has the idea that speech is dangerous led to a culture on campus that is eager to shut down speech? Dr. Franks, I'll start with you.
I will say that this is a longer conversation we could have, but that the constant discourse about how, students are so fragile, they want safe spaces, they need trigger warnings. I do think it's worth pointing out that there are around 4,000 institutions of higher education in the United States, and most of them go about their business every day without any kind of controversy, without any kind of trigger warning incident or protest of a speaker. So this is just a skewed perspective, first of all, to think about highlighting students and saying, at these particular elite universities, this thing happened and it means we're all in crisis. I think that it's a very deliberate attempt to try to vilify students as a whole. But I also think that the notion that fragility is bad and that some sort of speech is dangerous, it's interesting to see when that's going to carry some kind of weight and when it doesn't. So it seems as though for the last decade or so, people on the right in particular, but also joined by many people, by many liberals, classic libertarians, et cetera, beating up on students saying they're so fragile, they just can't handle bad ideas and they just can't handle anything. And then now suddenly we're being told conservatives feel like people won't like them if they express their ideas. Well, which one is it, right? Are you fragile or are you not fragile? Or does it really depend on whether you're conservative or not? So conservative fragility is something that is seen as a sign of weakness or something as true victimization, but everybody else's sense of being insecure or feeling like they might not be safe someplace, those things are just some sort of weakness that we can express with contempt. So I think that that's a really troubling division there.
Part of the reason why our campuses, why higher education is in crisis, is because of the therapizing of student affairs departments, the transformation of whether it's social slights or controversial or new ideas into problems of harm or safety, or arguing over constitutional cases before the Supreme Court means denying the humanity of some class of people, which is, of course, nonsense and should be understood very more easily as nonsense in a place of higher education where students are supposed to be taught to think critically. And they haven't been. And there's a complex rationale for that ranges from Jonathan Haidt's explanation with the psychology and the social media and the smartphones and all that, to the bureaucratization of higher ed with now more non-teaching staff than teaching faculty. Of course, those non-teaching administrators are not imbued in the culture of open inquiry and truth-seeking and the other academic values, and other developments, inflection points and polarization in our culture more broadly. But I think it can't be denied that far from safe spaces and trigger warnings, which is something more from about 5 years ago, it's still topical, but just an unhealthy political culture on campus where we don't have this spirit of open inquiry, where certain subjects can't even be broached in class, let alone taking the politically incorrect position on that subject.
I think this is an interesting place to go in terms of how open inquiry and free speech can lead students to develop critical thinking skills. And I want to go to Dr. Franks with this one. I'll just give one example of Dr. Christina Hoff Sommers, who between 2014 and 2016 was often either shouted down or canceled on college campuses because students had described her as a rape apologist. A lot of them had not actually read her body of work. And I think a lot of us would probably agree that that characterization is not exactly accurate. And so it was a way for students to avoid confronting the things that she was saying. And so I think the broader question is, can students develop critical thinking skills if they're not encountering perhaps minority opinions or opinions that aren't traditionally expressed in a university setting?
I mean, I speak as somebody who actually teaches in a university. I point this out only because so much of the hand-wringing and the criticism about the state of college campuses today comes from people who don't work in college campuses. And so I just want to submit, not that I have access to all of the information either, because my own perspective is limited to the places where I've been and the kinds of classes that I've taught and the students that I've encountered. But I really do want to caution people before they believe that the hysteria that we're often told about students by people who don't teach students. So on the one hand, what I would say is if there is a sense in which a student is refusing to encounter an idea, that is one kind of conversation to have. But it is very context specific, because do they need to encounter all ideas all the time? Do they need to encounter really stupid ideas all the time? Do they need to encounter ideas that are deeply challenging and interesting? Maybe yes. But these are all decisions that we have to make based on the context. What was this? Is it a lecture? Is it an organization? Is it something else? And we also have to consider the fact that, yes, students get it wrong sometimes because they're students. And that's the point of which we should be seeing to ourselves, this is a point of empathy. This is a point of modeling behavior. If there's something going wrong with students, well, let's have our first impulse to be to say, what is it that we, those of us who aren't the students, maybe have done wrong or haven't modeled well or haven't explained well? So students are saying, we don't want this particular person here, or we're criticizing this person because turns out in many of these cases, they feel that their university has looked the other way when it comes to actual sexual assault and harassment on campus. That's something worth listening to. And so it can't really be reduced to this idea of, do you like the speaker? Do you not like the speaker? Are you scared of this idea? But what is underlying a student's anxiety if they say, this person says that I have to give birth even if I don't want to. This person says that maybe rape was my fault. Those are things that we should care about because they do affect the quality of life for students and they affect the intellectual environment they're a part of.
I'm not here to impugn or indict student culture. I'm here to speak truth to power, to criticize those in power. The universities, specifically, I have my criticism of government entities as well, but what we're supposed to be debating here is that the university's failure. And that is at whose feet I lay the problems and pathologies in student culture that we've also been discussing.
A student writes in pointing out that they've had protesters here at Cornell demonstrating in study spaces, libraries, and other places. The student asked, what should the university do to provide space for students to express views while also protecting the rights of students like me to study for exams? And this sort of goes back to the Columbia question as well. Whoever wants to take this first, go ahead.
I mean, I think we've covered this. The rules are clear. You can protest, you can leaflet, you can table, to use that as a verb. You can do lots of things as long as you don't disrupt study spaces, classrooms, organized speaker events. There are public spaces where you can have a shouting match if you want, in the middle of the quad in the middle of the day, things like that. But you cannot disrupt educational programs.
Unless you're a university that decides to cancel its entire graduation ceremony because you don't like what the valedictorian might say. But with that in mind, I mean, what should universities do? That again, it's a hard question, right? Because you do have to balance competing student interests. But I think if we zoom out for a second and talk about the nature of protest, the nature of protest is that it gets in people's faces and that it's inconvenient and that it makes people have to pay attention to something they don't want to. I'm not saying that makes it right. I'm not saying that I'm not justifying any individual situation where protest is happening. Simply saying that if we're going to believe in the notion of protest at all, so long as it's peaceful, we have to accept that it's going to mean something like inconvenience, because that is at a minimum what protest has to do in order to be effective. So I wouldn't want to suggest that there is one rule that the university could always have, but that they'd want to balance those things. To think about the fact that you don't want to necessarily have a chilling effect and a silencing effect on your students for wanting to engage in protest, but also, of course, yes, wanting to ensure that students who have chosen not to be part of this, who have chosen to want to devote their time and energy to something else, that they are also accommodated.
I disagree. I think it is an easy issue. Those who are disrupting the study spaces in the library and what have you should be removed and disciplined appropriately. And if they're engaging in civil disobedience, if they believe that they're doing something to highlight an injustice, what civil disobedience means, taking the punishment and showcasing that and showing the absurdity. And if that's how you want to foment social change, that's great. But it's not a university letting them get away with it and hand-wringing over these rights versus those rights. The rules are clear. And the rules might be unjust. Fine, make that point, make the protest, get expelled, go to jail, make a cause célèbre out of it, and change the rules if they indeed are unjust.
And one final audience question before we go to closing statements. Is free speech on campus different, or isn't free speech on campus different than speech in other arenas because of obligations under Title VI?
This goes to, yes, Title VI and other time, place, and manner regulations, in the sense that lawyers talk about limited public forums and private forums and things like this. But there are things that you can do, in a can and can't do in a private club versus a business that's held open to the public versus an educational institution versus, in the middle of, a public park versus the middle of the street. So yeah, the context of where things happen matters. And there's also a contractual overlay. If you're a member of the community, if you've matriculated or have been hired as a faculty member, then you're bound contractually to observe certain rules as well.
It's not just Title VI, though, and Title VI is really important for the purposes of anti-discrimination on the certain bases. It's also Title IX, which also guarantees that you can't guarantees you as a student the right not to have a hostile environment based on your gender. So these are all important considerations. These are federal civil rights protections, and yes, they do make certain situations different on campus than on off campus. And also, just as a broad matter, though, I think we also need to understand that there's not that much outside of campus either that is also just a free-for-all and you can do whatever you want. There are lots of rules in lots of places. There's things you can't say at work that you could say on a street corner. There are things you could say in a public park that you can't say on public transport. So all of these things are important, and it is important to consider context. And yes, we should be considering not just certain forms of discrimination a la Title VI, but also important obligations to ensure that students are not discriminated on the basis of their gender, including sexual orientation and gender identity.
All right.
Well, Title IX says sex, not gender, but we can quibble about that.
I'm aware what Title IX says.
All right, we'll move to closing statements. But before we do that, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that we are going to start voting again on where you stand on the resolution. Again, the resolution is that universities are failing to provide a culture of free speech and open inquiry. You can agree, disagree, or perhaps maybe you're still undecided. We'd like to see if any minds have changed due to the tenor of this debate. And for our closing statements, Mr. Shapiro will go first. Again, he is arguing the affirmative, and you will have 5 minutes.
Well, look, the real danger here is that universities no longer focus on free inquiry and pursuit of knowledge. Instead, They deploy an army of bureaucrats that either distracts from that mission by providing therapeutic coddling or actively prevents truth seeking by enforcing an ideological orthodoxy. Having staff organize students' social lives and hold their hands while processing the traumas of new ideas infantilizes young adults who should be training for the workplace in public square. Having them organize trainings, rallies, and struggle sessions to enforce narrow perspectives on race, class, and sex prevents the development of critical thinking skills that students need to become well-adjusted professionals. It also shifts power away from faculty and gives it to political commissars whose goals diverge from long-held higher education values. Universities have warped terms like harassment and discrimination, as well as therapeutic terms like harm and safety, not to promote free discourse or a welcoming environment, but to enforce progressive ideology. The behavior of Stanford's DEI dean in egging on the mob against Judge Duncan last year was illustrative of how these regimes are antithetical to universities' basic missions. And then there's the shift from education to indoctrination. When I was in law school, way back in the dark ages, the early 2000s, critical theory with its Hegelian and culturally Marxist discourse was a spent force. It was something from the 80s or early 90s that became little more than niche theory with no direct application. But now the crits are back with a vengeance, and not just in literature or sociology departments. That shift, when coupled with the bureaucratic growth, has led institutions to prioritize activism over inquiry, seeking social justice rather than truth. Whenever university leaders stand up for free speech and the core truth-seeking mission of any academic institution, the mob disperses. We've seen this. But most presidents and deans are spineless cowards. They're not radicals. They're careerist bureaucrats, unwilling to confront the illiberal inmates that have taken over their institutions. Mere statements about academic freedom, declining to fire Supreme Court justices, aren't enough. Schools must instill a culture of respect for opposing views. That means dismantling DEI bureaucracies that undermine classical liberal values, ending loyalty oaths in the form of diversity statements. As I said, presidents and deans are really good at instituting whatever values they care about: public service, entrepreneurship, social justice, whatever. They can and should do that for open inquiry and free speech. When I left Georgetown, I wasn't holding my breath at the prospect of reform. But maybe now we're seeing a backlash to our illiberal inquisitors. I'm still not sure it can all be done from within, so we do need external controls from state legislators and attorneys general, and congressional oversight tied to federal funding. That's why we have these hearings, because there's federal funds involved. We also need exogenous shocks like Judge Ho's boycott of Yale and Stanford for clerk hiring, plus employers shying away from hiring those who support terrorist groups or who scream at federal judges that they hope that their daughters get raped. And we need public exposure. In February of last year, all it took was one Wall Street Journal op-ed published by an investigative reporter based on FOIA documents from Texas Tech to get that university's president the very next day to say, no, we would no longer hire our biologists based on diversity statements. The episode with Harvard's former president crystallizes the larger problem. Claudine Gay is a mediocre academic who was elevated for advancing progressive orthodoxy while checking intersectional boxes. She's the apotheosis of the intellectual movement on campus that values identity and activism over merit and education, that prefers political commissars over rigorous scholars. But that resignation and the resignation of others doesn't and won't end university troubles. In its most recent rankings, Spire named Harvard last, the worst in the country for free speech. But Harvard is by no means alone in all of that. It doesn't take long to destroy reputations built over decades and centuries. The question now is whether universities are willing to do the work to restore their tarnished stature. In December, Harvard professor Steven Pinker, no conservative, laid out a 5-point reform plan. Free speech was number one, institutional neutrality, enforcing university rules, viewpoint diversity. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge and promoting free speech, academic freedom, and open inquiry. But the battle's been joined.
Thank you very much. And Dr. You can applaud if you want.
Please clap.
And Dr. Franks, you will close us out with your own 5-minute closing statements.
Thanks. History's really instructive sometimes. February 8th, 1968. HBCU, South Carolina State College. Black students had been protesting for several days about a segregated bowling alley. Tensions were really high. And the governor called in the National Guard and the Highway Patrol to control these protests. And on February 8th, they opened fire and they killed 3 young Black men and they injured 28. It was the first police killing of students at an American university, but it certainly wasn't the last. Just 2 years later, 4 students were killed by the National Guard at Kent State during a Vietnam War protest. 11 days later, Jackson State University, Mississippi police opened fire on a women's dormitory after conflicts with Black students who were protesting conditions. They killed 2 young men and injured scores of young women. These are all situations where the powers that be said about student protests, this is dangerous. They are unruly. They're causing problems. We are going to need to call out force. We're going to need to call in the National Guard. And these are the consequences that we saw. But perhaps even more instructive would be to go back even farther than this, back to February 18th, 1943, to Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans, 2 students at the University of Munich who were members of the White Rose Resistance Group. This was a group that in secret was printing up pamphlets that described Nazi atrocities. And they distributed these pamphlets secretly so that other students would hear about them. In one of the pamphlets, they said, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience." These students knew that if they were caught, terrible, terrible things could happen to them. And indeed, on February 18th, something terrible did. They had some pamphlets left over in their suitcase, and they were in the University of Munich main building. They're standing at the top of the atrium, and they decide that they're going to just sort of send the last of their pamphlets down below. So they're just going to just toss them out and have them kind of just gently flutter to the ground below. And a custodian sees them, and he belongs to the Nazi party, and he turns them in. And they're arrested, and for several days they're tortured. They're interrogated. Sophie is told, "If you just turn in your brother and say it was all his fault, we'll let you go." And she refuses. And they're having a kangaroo trial on February 22nd, 1943, where they're not even allowed to present any witnesses. They're not allowed to say anything in their defense. And all the same, while the judge is ranting and raving about how they have betrayed their country, Sophie Scholl interrupts him and says, "We had to say something. Many people thought what we thought, but they weren't going to say it because we had to make a start." She and the other members of the White Rose were found guilty of high treason, and they were executed that same day by guillotine. On the way to her death, Sophie Scholl said, "What does my death matter? If through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action, the students," she said, "will rise up." She was 21 years old. When I mention that there are students who have made the ultimate sacrifice, I don't say this just to talk about their bravery. I do want to celebrate their bravery. I do want to celebrate their courage. I do want to hold them up as examples, but I also want to emphasize the tragedy of all of this, because no student should have to pay the ultimate sacrifice for trying to speak out against injustice. No student should be put in harm's way for having the courage to speak out against injustice. And what I think is one of the most important lessons that we can learn is that the people who want to put them in harm's way, those people are not on the side of free speech, and they are not on the right side of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of our debaters, Mr. Ilya Shapiro and Dr. Marianne Franks. I think that was a really fruitful discussion, and maybe some minds changed in the room today. But let's give a big round of applause for both of these wonderful, wonderful debaters. And thank you again to the Steamboat Institute and all of the other organizations that helped put on this fabulous event. And thank you to all of you for coming out and hearing this very important discussion. And here we have the results of the poll. I can't quite read it, to be honest. But some minds did change.
Was that before or after? What was before?
I think that's the after. That's
Okay, so before the conversation, 89% said that universities are failing to provide a culture of free speech and open inquiry. 5% disagreed, and 5% were undecided. And after the debate, it looks like pretty much
she got all the
undecideds went to Dr. Franks. Very well done.
Welcome.
I mean, I think it's a victory for both of you, if I'm honest. But wonderful, wonderful event. Thank you all for coming out, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Just to make some super brief closing remarks, thank you again to our debaters. Thank you again to the Cornell Political Union, the Cornell Heterodox Academy, and the Heterodox Academy at SUNY Cortland. I want to extend another thank you to our individual and foundation sponsors. Again, they make this program possible. They make these incredible discussions possible. The Adolph Coors Foundation, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, and Pete and Marilyn Coors are some of our greatest supporters, and we are so grateful that they help make these programs possible. If you enjoyed tonight's debate, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution. We can't rely on just those folks I named before. It takes all of us to continue to create an environment for these types of conversations and civil debate. You can donate on steamboatinstitute.org, and we appreciate all of you for your consideration. Again, if you enjoyed tonight's debate, you can find this debate and others on our YouTube channel. This will be posted just a couple days following this. You can find all of our other programs on YouTube. I encourage you to share this program with others. It's important that more than just the people in this room hear conversations like this. And thank you all for joining us again. And to those who joined us on the live stream, we appreciate you all being here. Thank you.